Hi. So my partner and I discussed that we were going to split the presentations in half. So I'm going to stop at estimating response to selection. That's the full first paragraph that was assigned to us. Um, so to start off, we have quantum genetics. Um, Quantum genetics is a result of how genetics and the environment interact. So, what you're born with, and then what has happened to you in the environment to create these phenotypic traits. Quantum genetics help us understand why differences occur. Um, it's not just because our parents gave us their genetics. There's all kinds of reasons as to what is going to affect how we develop, what turns our genes on, what turns our genes off, um, how we react to different things, our personalities, things like that. We don't really have much of a control over our height, our hair color, our eye color, but there are scientific ways where, as fetuses, those certain traits can be manipulated. Quantum genetics also show continuous variation of phenotypes, but on a spectrum. So it's not this or that, it's a variety. Um, Height and weight are two examples. Height can range, it's a huge spectrum. Weight is also a huge spectrum. Um, Quantum genetics is influenced by polygenic inheritance. And polygenic inheritance are multiple genes. Um, let's see. Genes that are better suited to the environment are allow for better phenotypes for the environment. So I think a good example might be like in China, how there's a lot of people in a compacted area, like a small area. So when we think of China, we often think of short and thin people. So that might be an example of the environment and genetics coming together to develop organisms that are better suited for their environment. Then there is quantitative inheritance. This is phenotypes that can be measured, that can be counted. Um, Obviously, phenotypes are derived from the genes passed on from your parents, and those genes are then counted, and we can get an average or an estimate of the phenotypes that are better to suit that environment. Quantitative inheritance um, is counted, but not everything is easily counted. Not all differences are obvious. Um, there's also the polygene hypothesis for quantitative inheritance. This is how many different pairs of alleles come together to affect traits. So it's not just one or two alleles that give you an obvious trait. Sometimes it can be multiple alleles that are combined, work together, that give you these certain observable traits or non-observable traits. Traits again are on a scale. It's um, there's so many people with so many different traits. You can't. It's not just yes or no or this or that. It's a scale. The scale is based on how many of the genes are interacting. We can use Punnett squares with multiple alleles, so polyalleles, to develop the percentage of what the phenotype will be. So instead of just having the dominant and recessive two genes in a square combined and matched with another two genes in a square, we might have 2 or 3 dominant genes paired with non-dominant genes, or paired with other dominant genes, or non-dominant genes like recessive genes paired with other recessive genes. We compare all of those up and you'll get different percentages and likelihoods of what an organism, what their phenotype may be, and what is best suited for that environment. The statistical tools for quantitative genetics, I just picked what I found on the internet. It looks like I found 7 different tools for quantitative genetics. I wrote those down and then I put what those tools, like how those tools are used in a way that I could understand so that I could relay it back. So we have variance component analysis. That's an estimation of how much a random effect contributes to variation. So what around us that wasn't planned is going to affect our phenotypes or our genetics. Maybe the air quality could affect our genetics. There's heritability estimation. So how much of the traits variation is due to genetics? Remember, over here on quantitative genetics, genetics aren't just derived from your parents. There's also the environment can interact with those genetics. They can affect which phenotypes will be present and observable and which ones you'll have. Trait variation is due to genetics, so the likelihood of you going to church might fall into this category. There's regression analysis, so comparing variables to one another and their relationship. So comparing different traits, different genes together, and how are they working together to create this phenotype or create like to turn off or turn on other genes. How are they working together to make you you, to make you have these certain qualities? There's linkage analysis, which is where the location of the chromosomes are. So we can look and see where these chromosomes are placed and determine if that plays part in their interaction with other chromosomes, I guess. Then there's quantitative trait Loci mapping, where the phenotypic variation occurs. So the phenotype is what we can observe. We can see where the variation is, what the differences are. We can compare them. Then there's genetic correlation analysis. This is how similar the effects of the genes are. So maybe that's comparing maybe 2 organisms of the same family, maybe 2 organisms from the same parents, and comparing their genes together and determining which phenotypes are present, which aren't, which genes are paired together, which aren't. which traits are observable and which aren't. And then there's the association mapping, how similar the genotypes and phenotypes. So which genes are paired up to see to make maybe observable phenotypes or non-observable phenotypes? Traits, maybe? How similar the genotypes and phenotypes are. Um, hmm. I guess I don't really understand this one, but I want to look more into it. Genotypes and phenotypes. Let me look. I want to understand this one better. So the DNA sequence of an individual, yeah, okay, compared to the phenotypes. So not all genes are observable, okay? And comparing them, which genes are paired together that aren't observable, maybe in one organism, but are in another organism. Then we have heritability, broad sense and narrow sense. This one was a little bit confusing to me, but I'll try to explain it the best that I understand. So, how well differences in genes account for differences in traits. So some examples might be eye color, how smart you are. Could be like mental disorders. Um, what is passed down from your parents that maybe they're the genes and they they are observable traits. Um, what is passed down to you? What is inherited to you? So what is the variation in the traits that cause the genetic variation? So what is passed down from your mother? What is passed down from your father that causes this genetic variation? Did they have any symptoms of mental health? Why do you? Why is this trait coming out, maybe? I don't know. Maybe they both had brown eyes and you have blue eyes, or maybe they had both had blonde hair and you have brown hair. Um, so as the environment changes, heritability of a trait can change. So traits aren't always like this is what they are. They can be turned off or turned off, turned off or turned on, and the environment can do that so that you can better live in that environment. So I think an example of that might be some like cave dwelling creatures are blind, but that's because they don't use their eyes. They've adapted to that environment. So the environmental factors can sometimes have a stronger effect than genes. So an example might be language. Um, if you are born in Germany and you learn German, you can come to America and learn English as well. And then you can pass both of those languages down. That's not something you're born with, that's just something that has been taught to you because of your environment. Um, then there's the genetic factors can sometimes have a stronger effect in the environment. So what you're born with can affect you more than the environment can sometimes, like mutations. The environment isn't going to make you have Down syndrome, but your genetics will. Then I go into the broad sense heritability. This is how genetic variation contributes to phenotypic variation. So, how your genes are combined in your DNA to determine what is observable. So, your height, your weight, your hair color, your eyes, how crooked or straight your teeth are, maybe. That would have to do with like your bones, how brittle your bones are. Um, the broad sense heritability also includes additive and non-additive genetic effects, dominance, and epistatus. So I went ahead and defined these because I didn't know what they were. I defined them. Additives are all the effects of the alleles in an individual. So all the alleles are going to have their own code, their own job, and they're additives. Then there are non-additive. So how alleles interact and what effects they have. So the alleles are going to interact with each other, and then they're going to have different effects on your body, on the cell. Non-additives are how alleles interact and what effects they have. That's non-additives. Then there's dominance, how alleles create variance. So not all alleles are going to match up equally. There's going to be a variation of alleles. Two cells can create multiple offspring, and those offspring may all do different things. Then there's epistasis, when multiple genes interact and affect the phenotype. So I think that we've talked about this earlier. The genes that you're inherited from your parents, along with the environment, are going to give you certain traits. Some phenotypic traits you don't have any control over, like what you're born with is the color of your hair or the color of your eyes. You can't change that naturally. That it's always, my hair will always be brown. Obviously, over time, that it's gonna turn gray, but I can't just wake up one day and tell my genes I want blonde hair and then have blonde hair. Then there's the narrow sense heritability. This is just the additive genetic variation taken from the total phenotypic variation. So this seemed like there was some math going on here. There was some dividing certain types of genes here, and then a total of all the alleles together. This determines the characteristic of an offspring from the genes passed down from parents. So the narrow sense would be what was passed down from your parents, and then what are your characteristics on that, not the environment. Since we know that the environment can play a role, if we eliminate the environment and we just look at what was given to us from our parents, that would be the narrow sense. I think that's how I understand it. The last thing I'm going to talk about, and then I'll leave the rest for my group mates, I guess. Last thing I'm going to talk about is estimating response to selection. So how the population's average traits will change through the generations due to selective breeding, heritability, and selective differential. So I didn't know what selective differential was, so I defined that. Selective differential is the measurement of a trait in the population and the parents for the next generation. what traits the parents will pass on to the next generation. So, estimating response to selection would include the traits that are going to change from generation to generation. Okay, so that includes what is inherited and what the environment is demanding because of selective breeding. So, um, if two brunette people continue to, we have children, and then only the brunettes have children or have offspring with other brunettes, then eventually we would not have certain um, dominant genetics in our line. I think that we can see that in royalty a long time ago when they used to have what they would consider clean blood or pure blood. But then they began to get really sick and very deformed. So that's what I think that this is talking about. Um, so how those traits are going to change based on your selective breeding, heritability, and the selective differential. So what's going to be passed down? And the heritability is, if we go back up here, we can remind ourselves what heritability is. How much the trait variation is due to genetics. So we can look at that. And let's see. I'm going to look at something here. Yeah, so that's what that's going to be. The estimation of the trait variation from the genetics alone, not the environment, I believe. So that's my presentation. I did include epigenetics, sex chromosomes, linkage, non-disjunction, sex determination, X and Y linked traits, and I also included my sources. I think this should be okay. All right, thanks.